Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining. We're gonna get started in a minute or two here. In the meantime, please use our chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Great to see. Usually on these, we're getting folks from all over the world, which is pretty exciting to see. But yeah, say hello and don't be afraid to keep active in the chat throughout the presentation. We've also got questions you can ask. So if you have a formal question for either me or Francis, who we'll introduce ourselves in a second, you can write them in the chat. But also, I would recommend you submit them as a formal question. That way, other folks on the event can upvote your question and make sure that it gets gets our attention. I don't think we're running any polls today, but yeah, definitely feel free to keep engaged with chatting and questions. We love when that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I guess we'll just we can introduce ourselves now. Probably makes sense. You want to start, Francis?
Sure. So thanks for joining. As Eric was saying, so I'm Francis. I run product at Appcues, and Appcues, for those who don't know, we're a marketing ops platform for it's actually PLG or like B2B SaaS companies. Looks like the words didn't fully show up there. But yeah, so I'm excited to talk PLG today and kind of go into a little bit of the challenges that we see a lot of teams face when it comes to leveraging all the data that's available to personalize and make the onboarding as relevant as possible.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to be here with Francis. In my role heading up marketing at Appcues, we are a product-led business ourselves. We are Appcues customers, and we like to think of ourselves as experts in the space of user onboarding. Right? We do it ourselves. We also sell a solution that helps make it easier. And we are constantly working with businesses from SMB all the way up to the Fortune 50 on their onboarding and user engagement strategies. So really excited to talk about where these two topics connect and help you all take your product-led growth and user onboarding to the next level in this kind of very complex B2B buying process. So as we dive in here, again, just a reminder to everybody who's joined in the last minute or so, please, we encourage you to be active in the chat, engage with other attendees. If you have any questions for Francis or I, we will definitely make time for those at the end of the presentation. Please use the questions tab to submit, and don't be afraid to upvote a question if yours is already asked. So, we're gonna get started today really kind of talking about the shift in general, like the primary drivers of product-led and why this topic is so important. Biggest thing is people just don't buy and use software like they used to, right? Preferences today are largely self-service as much as possible, super personalized, right? You think of all the B2C software experiences we've had for the last 5 to 10 years. Those expectations that we have as consumers are now the same expectations that B2B buyers have. There's really not much of a line between the two anymore. So when you think about the experience you have shopping with an Amazon, kind of cliche example, but who better as an example of personalization? You really never talk to anybody and really delivering on this immediate gratification, right? And just a little secret here: most software companies still are not meeting expectations. They have not delivered on these new expectations today. We ran a survey last year to our database and found that out of everybody we asked, 90% of people who use and buy software want free trial or freemium access to a product. Not totally surprising, but to see 90%, I remember a couple of years ago where some of these surveys were showing something like 60 or 70%. I mean, it's almost everybody wants to buy this way, right? And I think the more important part is as you're going through and evaluating vendors, making a short list, 89% of folks indicated that they give preference to brands with free products. So if you don't offer a free experience, whether it be a trial or freemium access, you could be missing out on an opportunity to even make it to the short list in the first place. So pretty compelling data I wanted to share there. And then in addition to that, I'm sure most of you have seen this, the MarTech 5000. It's been put out for years. I think a few years ago they added 5,000. This latest version actually has 8,000 companies on it. It's absolutely ridiculous. But the bottom line here is software has never been more competitive, and users have 1,000 options, and switching costs are super low. So we really need to make sure we're delivering on expectations, or it's just not going to work. And you see this reflected in retention trends, right? This is some data that Mixpanel pulled within the last year or two. But 8-week retention, right? Look at the drop off in week 1 and how it ends up at week 8, right? From a new user starting to use the product to week 8, you're averaging what, 15 to 20% retention. And even the elite companies are seeing huge drop off, more in that 25 to 40 range, let's say. But huge drop offs here very shortly after a user starts using the product. So this is all maybe depressing if you're a little behind, but we're going to talk a little bit about user onboarding and why, given what I just shared, it's even more important today to be getting the initial product experience that you're delivering right. And there's good news, and the good news is that great onboarding boosts overall retention, right? So it's not just how can I get somebody to stick around for a day or two. It's how can I get somebody to stick around long term? Setting the stage in that initial experience impacts longer term retention. This is some data that ProfitWell pulled. I believe it was 2019. So I'll see if they have an updated version of this. But the bottom line is they measured user sentiment, so how they felt, like what was do they have a negative or positive onboarding experience as declared by the user, and then how did they retain over a 3-week period, 6-week period, 9-week period, and beyond. And what you see in every one of these cohorts is a positive experience correlates positively with 3-week, 6-week, 9-week retention and beyond. So it's just a little bit of data. There's a lot more that we could share, but just wanted to give you a sense and make sure the message of onboarding not just being about day 1 or week 1 comes through here. So what is user onboarding? It's not new. Many of you probably already understand this, but user onboarding, it's the process of guiding new users to find value, right? So that promise you're making on your website, in your advertisements, et cetera, what you're selling, the dream you're selling to your prospects, how can you show them in short order that you can deliver on that promise and you can add value through your software? That's really what onboarding is about. What it is not, I want to make this really clear. I'm probably dating myself a bit here, but some of the folks maybe closer to my age will probably remember Microsoft's Clippy. So when you used Microsoft Office, and I especially remember in Microsoft Word, they had this little character that just told you everything you could possibly ever know about Word while you were trying to work, right? So most people found that incredibly annoying. Clippy is, I've never heard anything positive about this character or that feature. So I just wanted to bring that up to say it is not a comprehensive feature by feature tour of your entire product. It is specifically about getting new users to that aha moment, that moment where they realize you can deliver on their value. Beyond that, it's not set and forget. This is such a critical part of your customer experience that you should always be iterating on it, optimizing, testing and learning, etc. And lastly, although we'll really focus on that initial experience today, onboarding is never really complete, right? As your product changes, maybe you do a UI refresh, you add new features, etc. Even users who have been using your product for years will need to be re-onboarded in a way, right? So it's an ongoing process, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll really focus on that first, that initial experience. So I mentioned the aha moment. As we defined it, the pivotal moment when users first realize the value of your product. I think one of the more memorable examples I remember is Facebook had this, I think it was 7 users in 10 days or something like that. What they realized is that new users who added a certain number of friends within a certain time period had much better usage and retention long-term, right? So figuring out what that moment is for you, for Facebook, when a new user added those number of friends in that time period, they were able to realize the networking value of Facebook, right? Facebook's not super valuable unless you have connections. And so that's why, for Facebook, that's how they define their moment. For your product, every product's aha moment is different. But a couple of ways you can go about finding that. If you have product usage data, you can look at correlations between behavior in the first day or week with longer term retention. If you don't, you could listen to sales calls and try to see if there's kind of some pattern in when prospects go, oh, that's awesome, or like really react in a positive way, or kind of act surprised, or kind of like they're having an aha moment. It's a bit more of a qualitative view on it, but there are a few ways you can go at identifying this. And I think this is another moment or metric that you always want to be reevaluating and optimizing. As an example, this is a language learning app. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but essentially, the new user starts using it, learns a word, adds a few more words to his vocabulary, and then they give him a little quiz, and he gets the correct answer. And when that happens, that's how they define their aha moment, right? That's when the user realizes he's learned the meaning of some words through context, and that's really the value of this language learning app. So it's a super basic example, but just wanted to provide something tangible for you. And then the other thing you want to think about here in terms of objectives for onboarding is getting that new user to the aha moment as quickly as possible. It's typically measured through time to value, some moment from the time between sign up and activation, or hitting that aha moment. In most cases, you want to minimize that time, make that as quick of a process as possible. There are some exceptions to that, and we'll talk about one or two of those in a bit. But that's kind of aha moment and the time to value are really two ways that you want to be measuring onboarding when you get started. And then just a few best practices for onboarding, and this will all kind of set the stage for the content we'll get into next, is when you're thinking about your onboarding experience, really want to be thinking about three main goals. One, motivating your users. Two, guiding them, so actually guiding them down the path to that aha moment, and educating. I'll talk a bit about that one in a second, but motivating, there's some psychological, human biases that you can kind of take into consideration here. If you look at this MailChimp and Quora example, just working in some progress bars, right, to kind of show the user that they're making progress, how much more they have to go. There's this natural bias we all have that when we've made progress, we're more inclined to complete the task at hand, and when we can see that. So using little tips and tricks like this can help motivate users to continue down the road of onboarding. Guiding them to take action. So this is an example from Basecamp. With Basecamp, similarly to Facebook, it's not a whole lot of value unless you've got your team in there, you're communicating with each other. So right off the bat, they're encouraging new users to invite other team members, right? That's when you're going to realize the value of Basecamp. So that's really what they're pushing new users to do. And this can be as simple as, really in your face, you should invite teammates. In other cases, if your aha moment is a bit more complicated, you can have a series of steps. And then lastly, educate. I love this example as a learn by doing example from Grammarly. So, Grammarly, I don't know how to pitch their product, but essentially they're going to help you with writing, okay? And then if you really want to see the value of your product, of their product, you can either drop some of your own writing in there and they can evaluate it and you can see the insights. But what they chose to do is put some sample writing in there so that as you get into the product, you can start playing around and interacting with Grammarly right off the bat. And so you can start to immediately realize the value within a minute of starting to use the product versus putting that burden of uploading content on the user, right? So there's so many ways to approach these things, but just wanted the key takeaways here from this section is, onboarding is critical and it has impact on long-term retention. Two, you really want to be thinking about your aha moment. You want to get new users to that moment. So it's important that you define it correctly and iterate on it. You want to reduce the amount of time it takes new users to get there in general. Right? And then you want to be thinking about motivating, guiding, and educating users when you're setting up your first onboarding experience. So, that's the intro to onboarding. We'll go a little deeper on that, but B2B is pretty complex, and Francis is going to talk about some of the implications of that complexity next.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that's really interesting, even when we looked at the example of the learning app, is that to some extent it's a very kind of linear journey where you have someone who signs up for the app, like we're trying to get them to get to that first value, the aha moment, or kind of like that activation moment, and then from that you want to have you want to build usage patterns and get them to get ongoing value from the product so that you really build the habit of using the product, and hopefully they get so much value at that point that they're willing to swipe their credit card and become a customer. This very often is how we're kind of taught, like this is the framework that we're given to think about, oh, like this is how onboarding should be structured, and this is the customer journey. You go from a sign up to activation, engagement, and then at some point someone is going to pay. The challenge is that in a B2B context, there's actually way more complexity, because you might have people that don't necessarily activate the product. So if we move to the next slide, I think is maybe a bit more of an actual representation, where if you think within the context of a company, you might have someone who signs up only, that's the purple arrow, only to invite a new sign up. And that's what Eric was talking about, right? So then you could have this incentive of saying, okay, for Basecamp, you sign up. Well, we know that the next step is to invite people. But then there's a question of, well, you have people who might just sign up to invite other people. And you might have people who sign up to get value, and then they want to invite more people who then go into the funnel. And I think too often we think of it as a set of linear steps, like someone is going to sign up, get value, then invite someone who themselves is going to come in and get value. But the truth is, take like maybe like more like a stronger example of like procurement teams, right? Like procurement teams, when they set up an instance, they're not going to use the product. They're going to come in and they're going to invite a bunch of people, and then someone in there is going to be the person who's going to sign up and get value from it. And then later in the process, they will typically invite their manager, who is the budget holder, who will sign up and pay directly without going through any of the adoption. And this is like one of the things that I see a lot of companies struggle with, because they start realizing, well, we have a bunch of paying customers, but the person who swiped the credit card didn't take any of the steps we expected them to take before actually paying. What does that mean? How do we change our onboarding? And I think it's because most of the tools that we have out there, if we think of like the mix panels, the amplitudes, like all the analytics tool, have a very user-centric approach to the onboarding journey, and very few of them help you to actually look at the onboarding journey from an account perspective. On the account, like how many people do we have? How many people have activated? Do we have someone who's like kind of like clearly a champion, kind of like promoting within the company and getting more users invited? And do we have someone who's more of the admin, kind of like adding new people, changing the logo, changing the name of the instance? And there's such a breadth of different people that are going to interact with your product that it's really critical to understand that. And unfortunately today, we just don't really have that many tools out there that help us do this. If we go to the next slide, the analogy that I really like to use for this is, when you think of your kind of customer onboarding and the journey, this is like, I use and reuse this example because I think it works well. I love the story of the Lord of the Rings, because if I were to, give the one-liner, ultimately it's the story about a fellowship, and they have a ring and they have to destroy it. It's pretty straightforward, and there's a bunch of things that happen for them to go from point A to point B, where they can throw this piece of metal into lava, and hooray, everything is good. And what we see is that while there's like linear steps to get there, there's actually a bunch of different characters and protagonists who have different impacts in the story, and they are also going to have conflicting interests, right? So if you think of the humans, like represented by Boromir in the Fellowship, he has a vested interest where he wants to take the ring for himself and bring it back to Gondor, because he feels that he's closest to Mordor, so he understands what's happening there a lot better than the others. And this is something that typically will happen when you have a product that solves a problem, right? There are other people who are thinking about the problem that might have an interest in solving it in a different way. And how you actually pull them into the journey is critical, and just even acknowledging the fact that they exist, and therefore having an onboarding journey that is going to take that into account is really critical. And you can't just put all of your focus on Frodo, because yes, he is the one who's going to carry it and like lead us to the end, but in the first place, he's potentially not the one who starts the whole investigation, the whole story, right? Like you need to understand who Gandalf is, this kind of like overarching person who like drops like knowledge and bits and pieces here and there to actually get people together and initiate the whole story. So I think like even this, I think it's an exercise that I recommend people do internally, of just like map it out and try to figure out like within like the larger orgs that you're trying to onboard on your product, who is Gandalf, who's Frodo, who's Boromir, and then if you want, like you can figure out who the orcs are. But it's a relevant exercise to just like abstract a little bit of the complexity there and just have a common understanding that the B2B journey is a little bit more complex than we think, and we can't just say, oh yeah, we'll just like walk from one place to another and everything will be fine and easy. So if we move to the
I would
next
encourage
slide.
you, Francis, next time I would encourage you to find a role for Samwise, because he's maybe one of the most important characters in the movie.
He is.
Okay, cool. I just didn't want him to be overlooked.
He isn't, and he leaves and he comes back, like, and it's important to pull people back. Like the win back is critical. Don't lose your important customers along the way.
Exactly.
But the and actually, I mean, the true thing is like all of them are critical, right? If you in the Lord of the Rings, you remove one, the whole story falls apart, right? There's nothing, none of it will happen if you remove one of them, and they might seem far removed, and they're potentially looking at other things that are not directly related to your product, but you need Gandalf to like constantly remind people like this is where we're trying to go, and like there is this like bigger strategic initiative, and this is where sometimes like sales can be helpful to help Gandalf be brought back to light and become the second iteration of him.
Let's keep this going throughout, right? All right.
And so I guess like tactically what you can take from this, like an easy first step is to realize that generally in your user onboarding, there's really like, I guess like two at least like different types of users, right? You're going to have people who are here to use the product, they're core users, and what they're really looking for is getting value from the product because it's going to help them in their day-to-day. So when you think about the onboarding for them, it's really about showing them how do they get value from the product, how it's going to help them succeed in their professional or whatever. If it's product for your personal life, fine. And then it's how do they evangelize the product? Like they've gotten value from the products, and now they should invite other people to get more value from it. And potentially at some point they can swipe the credit card if they're a single user, or if they've gotten so much value that they're at that like final point of the linear journey. But then when we think about like the typical buyer, so if we go back to that one, it's a very different journey, because this like potential buyer is someone who will swipe the credit card but not necessarily go through all the steps of adoption. So it's really important that the onboarding for them is more about, let's actually give you an overview of what the product can accomplish for your team and why it's actually relevant, why it's going to help the team, why it's going to solve your problem from almost like a team management perspective and a team efficiency, or again, whatever it is you solve for the organization. But you don't want to pitch the features. You want to pitch the outcome of what the features can enable for that team. And that's where sales like can be helpful, or having an onboarding that's going to be more about education towards higher value and not education toward features. And that's like something that very few companies do, but the companies who actually manage to do this see amazing results, because to some extent, the buyer is one of the most critical signups you're going to get, and making sure that you properly explain the unique value of your product is paramount. So anyway, so making sure that that's like the first thing that you think about, and it's about how do they invite more people within the organization, and ultimately like why there's value in the premium version versus potentially like freemium or like a free trial or any of the free alternatives that are out there. And And I think that leads us to, I think, another layer of complexity that I find a lot of companies kind of struggle with out there is like, when we think about how do we support enterprise go-to-market motions in a PLG go-to-market strategy, very often there's this kind of idea that, oh yeah, like if we're gonna go enterprise, like ABM is still the way to go, and it's really hard to generate enterprise opportunities from the product. And so one of the concepts that I try to get people to think about is you really have different types of funnels when you think about like a PLG motion, right? So you have this kind of self-serve, which is the linear onboarding we're talking about. People sign up, they get value, they pay. Great. Then you have kind of like sales assist, which is like transactional. You might need a little bit of help from sales to help close the deal, but it's really, you know, people use the product and they might have questions on pricing, what's the right plan, and a rep can help them. And then when you start talking about enterprise, it's really going to be in that kind of either bottom up or top down, where either you go ABM and you find accounts, you sell to them, and then you do some kind of a POC or like get them to do a trial, but it's like very sales driven. Or on the flip side, you can have a couple like free users within these bigger accounts, and now you try to figure out, okay, like how do we get the account to become active to the point where we can consider the account to be qualified from a product adoption standpoint. And now it becomes easier to sell to them, finding the right person to talk to, or even figuring out how to get them to convert. The challenge there, if we go to the next slide, is that if you think of the really the sources of where your enterprise pipeline is going to come from, most of the time we see companies generate most of their enterprise pipe from hand raisers. So some way, somehow, someone is exposed to the product, and then they raise their hand and say, hey, I want to talk about the enterprise plan, and that generates opportunity. And it's the bulk of where enterprise ops come from. The challenge about that is, as a marketer, you have very low control over it. You can't just manufacture more hand raisers. However, on the flip side, you could manufacture more product signups. I mean, you can invest in ads and things like that to generate more traffic, get more signups. And to some extent, you can also have more active accounts, because once you have someone like who's active in the product, now you can figure out how to grow adoption within the organization. So over time, what as a company you should you would want to focus on, and if you slowly move, there's an animation to bring a couple of the funnels together. What we want to do essentially is to over time, move from having most of our enterprise pipeline coming from hand raisers, which again has like very low control, moving towards like active accounts and actually building that journey of saying, okay, we need to generate signups. Once we have a sign up, maybe that sign up is actually someone who is this potential buyer that we can get them, we try and get them to raise their hand and we educate them towards that. Or if they're a core user now, we want to drive them towards becoming the source of an active account. So we want to get them to drive more adoption within the account, and we educate the account, get more users, bring more people in. And from there, either someone is going to realize, oh, wow, you know, people are adopting this product. Maybe we should talk to one of their reps to figure out what we can do with it. Or you have your reps kind of go outbound and figure out this is an account that's really active. Let's go talk to the person who has a vested interest in moving our account to an enterprise tier. And this kind of journey and mapping it out and understanding like how much of your opportunities come from where and how you want to shift that enterprise source mix in the future is one of the core fundamentals of a successful enterprise strategy in PLG. And most companies struggle big time with this because they don't have, I guess, like the foundationals to have a good diagnostic of what is happening and how do we change anything. So this is something that I highly, again, recommend you spend time on and looking at where your deals are coming from. And even if you're just seeing like most of our deals are coming from people who raise their hand, the question is, okay, do we have an active account from that same domain? AKA, is this really like an out of the blue person who raised their hand because they heard about you? Or is it someone who is not a product user, but knew that people were using the product and therefore came to figure out how to buy the product? And that is critical to understand because it's going to inform from a demand gen perspective, from a marketing ops perspective, where you put focus and which parts of the overall account journey you can impact strongly.
Yeah, and if you if you think about everything Francis just laid out, and then layer on top of that, personas, different types of users with different goals. I mean, it can get very complex, right? So the value of segmentation, I hope, is becoming very clear here. And even if you think that your funnel or your go-to-market is really simple, even if that's the case, you're still going to have all of these different ways that users can differ, whether they're coming in for the first time, or maybe they created their account and finish onboarding, came back 2 days later, technical versus non-technical users, et cetera. So there are a million ways, even if you believe your funnel to be pretty simple, a million reasons to get focused on segmentation here and tailoring the experience to each individual case, right? So, to revisit that aha moment point from earlier, if you were dealing with multiple personas, let's just use that as an example. You've got 3 different types of users. You've got, a core user, you've got a buyer, and then you've got maybe an executive who cares about reporting, right? They're all going to have different aha moments. Your core user is going to be looking for the core value of the product in their day-to-day. The buyer probably just wants a really easy way to put the credit card in and complete the transaction. The executive is probably going to want to be pointed right to dashboards or some kind of way to get an idea of what's going on in the account. And as you think about identifying that aha moment for each one of those groups, you're going to need to do some analysis, whether it be quantitative or qualitative, to figure out what that aha moment is, and then create a unique experience for each of them. And as you do that, you're also going to realize that segmentation in the analysis part of this is really important too. Not only do you have different personas and looking to achieve different things, but there's also a lot of noise, especially when you have a trial or freemium offer. And I think Francis is going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. This is something that, again, kind of sharing some of the challenges that I see very frequently, and things that kind of slow companies down in terms of figuring out what is the right thing to address in the onboarding. And so this example, I think, is, happens very often. So this is a company that we were working with, and when they came in, this was like their daily retention, which ultimately is very similar to what Eric was showing early on, where we're seeing this massive drop off of retention off to day one. And essentially, they're a high volume B2B SaaS freemium. I think they were getting in the around like 30,000 signups per month. So fairly high volume. And they were looking at this and they were saying, okay, like at the end, we're not getting like high enough conversion rate. And when we look at the daily retention, it clearly seems like we have an issue where we're not able to keep people engaged with the product after day one. So we need to focus all of our attention on how do we actually get people to come back into the platform after day one. And I can guarantee like most PLG companies out there have like similar kind of graphs. And we'll have a similar problem to what this company had. And so the first thing that we actually did is we thought, and there's an article that we have on our blog that I recommend reading, or even just like read on Wikipedia. There's something called the Simpson paradox. There's like a statistical anomaly that happens a ton in marketing. And so if we go to the next slide, what we did is we actually said, okay, we have an idea of what the trend is on an average, but now let's actually look at a random cohort of signups. And like, regardless of their behavior, let's try and identify what percentage of those are, a good fit for the product. Like they could get value from the product versus how many of those are people that just wouldn't get value from the paid product. Like they might like use it, but it really isn't necessarily designed for them. And what we found was, again, because like typical in like these like really high volume PLG setups, you end up having about like 70, and it ranges from like 70, 50, sometimes like 90% of your signups that are actually, personal emails, like spam, people using disposable email because they just want to take a look, or like even just like test the sign up. And ultimately all of those, because they represent such a big portion of your cohort, their behavior is going to drive the average. but to some extent, their behavior is irrelevant because you have little to no control over it. So no matter what kind of onboarding you try to do to make it better for them, it's never really going to have an impact on the numbers. So if we go to the next slide, what we then did is we actually looked at what the daily retention looked like against each of these like qualities. And again, not to pitch Appcues, right? But an easy way to do this, like just take company size, or even just like separate personal emails versus non-personal emails, and then maybe bucket by company size. And what you'll see is that there's generally like a really big difference in daily retention against like these different like segments of the cohort. And this is why segmentation is so critical. And so what we found for this customer is that when we were looking at like day 2 retention for what was considered to be not a garbage lead, essentially, the day 2 retention was at, was above 80%. So they really didn't have a kind of activation or engagement issue there. However, what was interesting is that even though like 75% of the cohort was still active after 25 days, they were really struggling to get them to convert. And so what they really had as a company was a monetization issue where they were not able to figure out how to get people to understand the value of converting to the premium product. And therefore, at the end, like they were not getting enough money. But when they looked at it, they thought the problem was retention, when in fact, no, the problem was like, how do we pitch to people who are getting value from the product, the reason that they should be moving to a paid plan. And this is like such a typical example of a ton of effort being put into onboarding. And unfortunately, nothing is happening. Like just like piling on like more workflows and more flows, and everything looks amazing. And like the customers you talk to say, yeah, like the onboarding was awesome, but you're not seeing like any big uptick in the numbers. And it's generally hiding the fact that you're looking at, unfortunately, numbers that are irrelevant, and your onboarding might actually already be good for the right kind of customer. So segmenting and making sure that you're going to focus actions on cohorts where you can have an impact because you know that they could get value from the product is really critical.
Yeah, and also just making sure that you're measuring that your data for measuring the effectiveness of these programs is quality too, right? Because if let's just take the example of you have an invited user who joins an account simply to input credit card and complete the transaction. If you're calculating them into your activation rate for the core user and long-term retention rate, that person's probably not going to sign in very often. So it's just noise, and it just makes your data less reliable, right?
Right.
So a million reasons to start segmenting, both on the experience side and on the measurement side. And so before we wrap up here, just a few more things to touch on. We're going to give you some tips for getting started with this process. So I'll just start before I dive into this example. There are many ways that you can use data to segment and personalize experiences. I'm going to talk about a few examples inside of the application. That's where a lot of software onboarding is happening today. Francis has an example of personalization outside of the product by email as well, especially when there's a sales assist. But a few ways you can get at this data. One, the easiest way really is to ask your customers, ask your new users, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about approaches for that. But you can also bring in data from your CRM. You can look at product analytics to see how people are behaving. You can use third-party enrichment and AI. So there are a few ways to do this, but I'm going to focus on declared data here because it's one of the easier ways to get started. So this is an example from Twilio, and something I mentioned earlier is you talk about reducing friction in the process, and that's true for the most part, but it's not true all the time. And what Twilio does here is they put folks through a 3 or 4 step basically questionnaire, asking them what they're hoping to accomplish, who they are, etc. And then they use those inputs to then personalize and optimize more broadly the experience that follows. And my guess, given what a strong company is, and what a strong and smart company Twilio is they've looked at, what's the impact of putting folks through this experience, and I'm assuming it's a net positive for them. Another example from us, so this is at Appcues, if you invite a user to your account. So a lot of our new trialers are tend to be core users, but they do invite other teams. And one of the teams that's most often invited is engineering or developer, because a developer can assist our core users with the installation of our SDK in your product, right? And so when you want to invite a new user, we ask you to not only put the person's basic info in, but establish their permission level and declare what function they're in. If you declare that they're in engineering, we're going to deliver a different experience, right? Because that person is not going to be thinking about creating in-app content with Appcues. They're going to be thinking about, can I trust this company? Can I trust their code in my product? Where's the documentation, et cetera, right? So it's pretty clear how the experience could be different. And this is one of the ways that we're capturing that right now. And then one more example I really like. So I did a workshop with growth hackers a few months back, and we did some live onboarding assessments. And this company, Autopilot, had just relaunched their product or redesigned it at a minimum. And I walked through it live, and it's similar to Twilio in that they ask questions about the business, what your goals are, et cetera. But what I really loved about it is that at each step, and I seem to remember there being like 6 or 7 steps, they were showing when you selected an option, they were either showing on that screen something changing and being customized, or on the next screen, there was a new level of personalization based on your previous answers. So if you have the opportunity to do that, I think that's thinking back to motivation and how motivation is one of the keys to effective onboarding. Showing people that what they're telling you and this frictionful, I guess that's a word, process that they're going through is already improving their experience. And that gives people a lot of confidence that it will ultimately continue to improve their experience long term. So just a few ideas for how you can capture that. And then I think on top of that, when you think back to some of the slides that Francis had on, what stage are these people at in their journey, layering that stage on top of declared data is a recipe for success in my opinion. And I think there was a question about like, what is declared data? Okay, you answered it, Francis. Great, cool. And then, like I said, another example outside of the app that Francis will walk through.
Yeah, I think and this is another one that is increasingly difficult in the PLG realm, because like we already struggle as go-to-market folks, like when there's an interface between sales and marketing, and there's like already like tensions there. In PLG now we're also bringing in product, right? So now you have like product, they want to own the onboarding, but you have like marketing is kind of like typically like owning the overall customer journey, and then you have sales like trying to close deals and make quota. And I think one of the challenges here is that you really have to be very thoughtful and deliberate in terms of what is the customer journey you want to orchestrate, and make sure you don't try to cram everything in the experience through one tool. And I think there's some cases where old-fashioned sales reps can be super helpful, especially in helping people who don't know necessarily what they could do with the app, and that can really enhance even further the experience of having tooltips or any kind of like guided onboarding in the app. And so this is like a simple example, but I think it's more just like trying to help you think about when you have a core user versus a buyer signing up for the product, like how do you differentiate the message, and like what do you want to pitch in one case versus the other. So for this one, for Cloud App, when the core buyer is signing up, and they even had like more segmentation on who the core user is. So for an account executive, what is the value that we can talk about? Like, how are you going to get value from the product? And that's the main part of the pitch. So it's not even asking for a meeting, it's just saying, hey, like as a rep, this is the kind of stuff that you should try to do with the product, because that's how you're going to get value. So it's kind of further, reinforcing the message that they're probably getting from the onboarding in the product. And however, for a buyer, it's more about, here's how your team is going to get value. Let us help you understand how your team is going to get value from the product. And if you don't want to talk to us, here's like some kind of like self-serve information on like how different teams could get value from it. But really the call to action is more like, let us, help you and educate you as to like why this can be valuable, rather than hope the CEO is going to go in and like test all the functionality and realize, oh yeah, this is something that we should buy for our sales team. So I think like really understanding like where the 10x can be on the channel of interaction with the customer. Is it like a like sales kind of like pushing for an educational call versus something that's triggered in the app? And there isn't a one size fits all. And it's almost, think about it at a very low scale. Like if you were to onboard every customer's yourself, like what would you try and do? Would you try and like pop-ups here and there in the app? In some cases, yes. But then for this other customer, maybe you would want to be able to talk to them and give them a demo and show the value there. So I think it's really critical to think about the journey at that kind of like low scale perspective. And then from there, build up processes that support the same level of segmentation at a higher scale.
Totally. Yeah. And, you know, these are just a few examples of how you can use segmentation to personalize an experience. But, you know, like Francis said, like I've said a few times, there are plenty of ways you can do this. You can use this approach in any communication channel, and even manual ones like sales outreach. So.
Yep.
So yeah, you know, we could talk about this for hours, but that's going to wrap up the content we had today. Hopefully it was helpful getting a sense of, you know, user onboarding, you know, the complexity of B2B and how segmentation can help bring those two together to deliver really personalized experiences for every single user of your application. We didn't get a ton of questions. Maybe that means we are just incredibly thorough. One of the questions was, will there be a recording? And the answer is always yes. We will have a recording. The other question was, are there any examples of companies that have good buyer onboarding, buyer-specific onboarding? And frankly, I do not know off the top of my head of any examples that I would share with the crowd. But I'm happy to look into that, and maybe there's an opportunity for some content on that.
Yeah, I've seen a couple in the past. I think on the, and I'm trying to remember, and you know, one of the things that Eric was saying is that it's never set and forget. So one of the challenges that what we're like experiences that we're talking about today might not be live tomorrow. I think like Basecamp is a good example where they just like revisit everything, they just like throw everything out every like other months. But I think on the there's a couple like financial tools. If I think of like Spendesk or Expensify, if I remember correctly, I think Expensify had a really cool separation of like the buyer versus like core user onboarding, where for the core user for Expensify, it's really about like how easy it is to go in and like submit your expenses. But for the buyer, it's more about like, how do I have control over the, you know, overall number of expenses that are coming through, and like, how do I approve the reports, and potentially less about how you actually submit reports. And from what I remember, when I signed up, I think like when you get invited as like a manager, your onboarding is tailored differently. So it doesn't focus as much on how to submit expenses, but more on how to review expenses of the folks that you manage. And I think that was like a really smart thing to do. And it talked about like how it's like, even their messaging is more about how your team is going to be more efficient and how you're going to be more efficient, and how your team is not going to be wasting hours at the end of the month. I mean, again, like I'm going to give out my age by saying this, but back in the day, as a traveling sales rep, you would have to keep, you know, like all the receipts. And then at the end of the month or the quarter, you'd like scan all of them and like submit paper expense reports to your finance team, which first off for the finance team was absolute horror. But for you was also terrible because you had to like go through like this pile of receipts. And I think like Expensify did a good job of, on the one hand, pitching to the AEs of like, this is why you should tell your CEO to buy Expensify, because you're wasting time at the end of the quarter doing this. Whereas on the CEO side, it's more about, hey, like this is how much more closing your reps could be doing, and this is how it's going to be much easier on like every division. Like the finance team is going to love it, the reps are going to love it, and for you, it's just like less stuff to think about. So I think that's like in the finance area, I feel like there's a couple like that that are pretty decent.
Yeah, that's a great example. Cool. All right. Well, if that does it for questions, yes, Bonnie, you're welcome. Bonnie said, "Thank you, Francis, for answering that."
Sweet.
Yeah. So it sounds like that does it. So again, appreciate everybody joining. Hope this was valuable for you all. We will send out a link to the recording. And don't be afraid to connect with Francis and I on LinkedIn or anywhere else on social. I know, pretty sure Francis is like me. I'm always hoping to connect with folks and expand my network. So don't hesitate.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Sweet.
Awesome. Take care,
All right,
everybody.
well, have a good one.